This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Representative Steve Cohen on debt, Delta Airlines, and the state of Congress tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. We are joined tonight by U.S. Representative Steve Cohen from the 9th District. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome, Eric. Nice to be with you.
Also joined by Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. We'll talk tonight. Thank you for we wanted to have you on the show for quite some time.
But you never asked.
We never asked. Well, I know I asked, so I'll put it there. We'll talk international, we'll talk local, we'll talk national. I want to start, though, with something in the news right now, which is the surveillance program, the NSA surveillance program. You were a major critic of George Bush, Patriot Act, and some of those things that came out of the Bush administration. This, in many ways, this NSA surveillance is an extension, it seems, of the Patriot Act. How do you feel about it? Do you want to see it reined in? Do you want to see it change the surveillance program?
I have never supported any parts of well, there are parts of the Patriot Act, but I never supported the Patriot Acts. And when they came up for reauthorization during the time that I served, including under President Obama, I've opposed them because I felt like it was an infringement on privacy. This is a situation where a lot of people believe it is an infringement on our privacy. It is clear, and I think the President has tried to make it known, and I think it's true, that they're collecting data. Metadata. It's the numbers, not the conversations. And they're not looking at them unless there's a connection to terrorism and they can make that connection. I think some people do think somebody's out there, Big Brother's listening. There is the potential for Big Brother listening, and that's the problem. And as we saw in the 60s, J. Edgar Hoover abused his powers in many instances, and so did Nixon thereafter. And FISA came into effect in the 70s. So I think there's concern for abuse of the storage of information on citizens, that it's more than is necessary. We have had a classified hearing with the head of NSA and others in this intelligence areas. We'll have another one next week. I look forward to all the information I can avail myself of. And I've got some amendments I'm going to propose to the FISA bill and hope we can improve it for the safety of our citizens.
It does seem like you're getting a lot of people, politicians, government officials, the companies like Apple and Verizon, some of these companies that are providing data, saying, let's put more transparency on the situation. That there are people who say you got to do this to prevent terror, attacks and so on, but there could be more transparency, there could be more disclosure. Is that the direction you'd like to see it going?
Well, it's one of the directions, and I think that the FISA court's opinion should at least be made more transparent. Now, they can't give away classified data within those opinions, and sometimes it's hard to redact the information and still give the opinion, but somehow that could be accomplished, I believe. I don't like the composition of the FISA court. Right now, the FISA court's appointed, there are 11 members, appointed by the Supreme Court Chief Justice. It made me think, and it's maybe a little bit fine-tuning, but it made me think, well, who's on the court? 10 of the 11 appointees were appointed by Republican presidents. That doesn't necessarily mean they all think alike. For instance, John Paul Stevens, one of my favorite justices, was appointed by a Republican president and turned out to be a very balanced and toward progressive justice, and there have been others like that. But I think it shows a possibility that most of the people in the FISA court have a certain way. So I'm proposing that we change that, and we have 3 appointed by the Chief Justice, 4 by the leaders in the Senate, and 4 by the leaders in the House. So that at least be 4 of the 11 will be appointed by a different political party and possibly have a different persuasion toward privacy. And I also think we should have opinions made public, and I think you should have at least 60% of the justices say that something is valid before it's valid, so that you've got a strong support for any action taken for the interest of security of our country.
Okay. Bill.
Congressman, should members of Congress have been surprised by these revelations? Was this something that Congress signed off on or that Congress knew it signed off on to this extent?
Well, Bill, that's still not exactly clear, and I did say that that the officials in our first briefing suggested or stated that there were many hearings that they had made available in data through the Intelligence Committee, where they asked the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Mike Rogers, to make available to us information. I don't recall any of that, and don't believe that occurred. Now, Mike might not have passed it on or said he can come in and see this or whatever, but I remember some opportunities to be briefed, but I don't know how many times. And he said Judiciary, which I'm on, and Intelligence. So I thought that maybe Congress was a little asleep at the wheel and they'd supported this, and they should have known better. But I've asked for information from those individuals, specifically the dates and the purposes of those briefings, because they might have overstated their bounds in what they said. You know, one thing that you know about intelligence people, they don't tell the truth. That's their business, is to lie. And I had just been in Russia, which I'm sure we'll get to, and met with the FSB, the deputy in charge of the FSB, which is their KGB successor, and their business is lying. And so, you know, we found out that the NSA folks lied to Senator Wyden and lied to other senators, Mark Udall, in questioning in the Senate, and then said something about I was as truthful as I could be under the circumstances. Well, I mean, it's a lot of mirrors and smoke.
You mentioned Russia. You were in Russia recently. Tell the viewers a little bit why you were there on a delegation with some other congressmen, follow up to the Boston bombings, correct? It
was Dana Rohrabacher, who's a good friend from California, a Republican, invited me to go with he and Michelle Bachmann and Steve King, which some would have thought of as Murderers Row, and to some extent
it is. It's kind of an eclectic group.
It's kind of uniform in their objections even to Boehner.
Yeah.
And they've been the leaders in the anti-Boehner world. There was one Democrat for 2 days, Bill Keating, and there was another Republican who's become a good friend, Paul Cook, who's a freshman, 70-year-old freshman, who calls, he says, I'm just an old dumb Marine. Well, he's not dumb at all, and he's a brilliant guy, really. And I got to kind of be real fond of him and appreciative of his experiences. But we went to Russia to look at kind of a follow-up on the Boston terrorism. We had meetings. We went to North Ossetia as well to visit the Beslan school, where there was the death of about 320 people, 180 children in 2004. Terrorists took the school. Terrorists responsible, but the Russians didn't want to negotiate, came in and caused the roof to come down, and terrible tragedy. And then we visited with different people in Russia, and I don't know that we found out too much additional information, because again, as I say, the FSB, you don't know if they're lying to you.
Yeah.
But they claim they had asked for data, and I believe they did. The FBI Director Mueller confirmed at a hearing when I asked him that they had requested information when Tamerlan Tsarnaev was returning to Russia. They wanted to know, and the FBI didn't tell them. And they said if we'd have known, this tragedy might not have occurred. Quite possibly. I presume what he was saying, it's a presumption and a leap, is that they'd known he was in back in Russia, in Dagestan, which he was in I think it was 2012, that they'd offed him. They offed two of his buddies, and he split right after that.
Yeah.
So, you know, we should have told them, but we didn't tell them, and it was an error, and FBI Director Mueller said, we've corrected that error. Well, hopefully they have, but they shouldn't have made it in the first place. They also gave them information about this fellow that was down in Orlando, was killed by FBI agents during his interrogation, where he was allegedly about to sign a confession for murdering 3 citizens in Boston, one of whom was a friend of Tamerlan Tsarnaev's. And they were marijuana dealers, and allegedly it made it look like a marijuana drug death, but they left $5,000 in cash and sprinkled their bodies with marijuana. And the guy, Tsarnaev, didn't come to the funeral. So it's thought that maybe Tsarnaev could participate with this other gentleman of Chechnyan descent to kill him. And allegedly, but the Russians tipped us off about this guy because they were listening in their conversations, apparently in Boston.
Yeah.
So there's all kind of people out there listening.
You talked about going there with a group of Republicans and who are friends of yours. That gets to a thing that people they think of Congress that, well, there are no friendships between Republicans and Democrats. It's just one big dysfunctional group. Is it? You're now in your fourth?
My fourth term.
Fourth term, 8 years or so. Is it as dysfunctional as it seems?
Not dysfunctional on a personal level. I mean, Republicans and Democrats get along. We're friends. I've got lots of Republican friends, lots of them. And Dana Rohrabacher's always wanting me to do things with him. And
but is it dysfunctional in terms of getting things done?
yes, it is. It's dysfunctional in getting things done, and it's dysfunctional for several reasons. One is that we shouldn't be having to raise so much money and spend so much time raising money and campaigning every 2 years. The term should be 4-year terms, split with people running in off years, half the people every 2 years, so you still get a flow from what the country's feeling, but people get a 4-year opportunity. That won't happen because the senators don't want House members to have a free shot at them. So that constitutional amendment won't occur. And you also ought to have a redistricting law that John Tanner started, and Heath Shuler had, and I've picked up from them, to have nonpartisan kind of judicial, quasi-judicial redistricting so that districts aren't just totally Democrat or totally Republican.
Because this gets to the whole thing that people talk about, critics talk about, that, again, districts that are carved out for a single party means that the Congress people can go be very unpopular on a national level, but extremely popular in their home district, and that creates that dynamic where they have no incentive to vote against the interests of their very narrowly defined district.
Exactly. Well, they're a very narrowly defined interest group.
Yeah.
You know, and so if you have a Tea Party Republican, which we've got in the 8th District, he has no reason to reach out to his moderate Republican or Democrat folks.
But is the same true for you in terms of being in a district that's heavily Democratic, that you don't have that initiative to reach out to Republicans or people of other, persuasions?
Theoretically, that's true, but in fact, it's not, because I've always represented people from my Senate district, and I try to represent everybody, and I've got a lot of business interests and not-for-profit interests and that I represent. So, I guess I don't reach out to the Tea Party, because I'd have to have some kind of long arms.
It's a tactful way. Bill.
During the re-election campaign, you talked at that time, because it was also presidential election year as well, and you said at that time that you thought that once this presidential election was decided, the Tea Party would pretty much be out of gas, because people would look and they would say, all right, we had this discussion about President Obama. He's either been reelected or he hasn't been reelected. End of story, let's get on. Has that played out the way you thought it would?
Yes and no. The Tea Party is still a very strong element in the Republican Party, and it's one of the reasons Speaker Boehner couldn't pass the Farm Bill, will have trouble passing immigration, and probably won't get a background checks on guns. The Tea Party is adamant against all those things. And they've got certain members who would rather appeal to the Tea Party constituency than the Speaker. The Speaker doesn't have the power to deal with them like old speakers did with earmarks and other options. But the Tea Party still has strength, but at the same time, you look at Sarah Palin and Michelle Bachmann, nationally, they're toast. Rand Paul is still strong, and he's trying to make himself a presidential candidate. But I think the Republicans realize that to have a president, they're going to have to get beyond that kind of constituency, and they're going to have to appeal to a more Howard Baker, Louis Donaldson, Bill Scranton, Charles Percy, if I'm not dating myself, type of Republican. And that they can find them again, that's what they have to win, and that's why they need to appeal to Hispanics, Latinos, and immigration, and appeal to some soccer moms on guns, and not just be with the NRA and be with the people who are afraid of people that don't look like them or sound like them.
What about in Tennessee? You were in the state Senate for...
I was sentenced to 24 years.
24 years. You were also county commissioner before that. But on the state level, there's arguably something of an inverse of what you're talking about, where the Republicans are dominant. They dominate the state House, they dominate the state Senate, governor, both senators, and 8 of the 9?
7 of the 9.
7 of the 9, excuse me. Congress people. So what, for you as a Democrat, a lifelong Democrat, what does the Democratic Party have to do at the state level to reach out? Does it need to look to a different model of people to grow its base?
I don't know. It's hard to say, because I've been invited, and I may go, but I've been invited to speak to a major Democratic group in East Tennessee in the fall, and I don't have plans to run for statewide office. So, in a way, why go? I mean, there's the good of going to rally the troops and tell them about what's going on in Washington, and they want me to come speak. But the reality is, there's not going to be a Democratic governor anytime soon, or a Democratic United States senator anytime soon.
But is that a failing of the Democratic Party in Tennessee?
I think it's somewhat a failing of the Democratic Party. And when I came up, the Democratic Party was really dominated by a group of people that got things done, but they were ethically challenged. And I think it's left a scar on the party. And they were very, like they were a family. They kind of controlled things and kept things to themselves, and it was like a mafia. And they kind of called it. I mean, Gentry Crowell was the godfather. He committed suicide before he had to testify and maybe implicate others some years ago, back in the 80s. And they didn't leave a good taste in people's mouths, and I think they didn't take certain issues. When I championed the lottery, which may be one of the more popular initiatives and successful initiatives in this state's history, it was tough for me to get the Democrats or the Republicans on board. And I finally got my 22, but the Democrats didn't embrace it. And when I ran in 2002, Phil Bredesen just kind of did the least he could to support it, but hedge it, and they were hedging their bets. I was reading the Blue Book the other day, and the little 2 sentences they give to Phil Bredesen, one of them was when he ran for re-election in 2006, his accomplishment was he'd signed the lottery bill. And I thought that's all he did with it, was sign it.
With the long arms you talked about before.
The extremely long arms.
Yeah.
And so, it's just the party hadn't gotten the progressive group that it needs to appeal to young people and appeal to progressives and maybe grow itself, and it hadn't done that, and I don't know if it can. And I don't really deal with the state party.
Yeah. Let's switch. It's a very local issue, but I want to kind of frame it in more of a national debate. Right now, City of Memphis is in a huge budget crisis, for lack of a better word. They're under a lot of pressure from the state to make some tough decisions. They're trying to balance, as everyone knows, keeping the tax rate low or even decrease it with the fact that they need to, they've got long-term benefit obligations, healthcare benefits to retirees, and they've got staff that they can't afford. They're midway through a process where they're going to be cutting, it looks like, positions and cutting people. It's a big problem, and it's not unlike, I think, on some level, the national debate about deficit spending and long-term benefits in terms of Medicare and Social Security. Do you see a connection between those debates? And it plays out in one way on the national level, in part because the federal government can just print some money to make up the gap. But on the local level, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Eric, I could see a little bit, but not really. I think on the federal level, things are getting better. We still need a jobs bill. We still need an infrastructure bill. And we've woefully inadequately funded our infrastructure and maintained it, and that'll cost us in the long run in productivity as well as possibly loss of lives and the high cost of repairs when bridges crumble and problems occur. But we can grow ourselves out of that. And the federal government is supposed to go into debt to finance infrastructure and other needs and grow, just like a family mortgages a house. They grow into it and they earn. And the city government's got problems. Mayor Wharton's got a tough job, and for years they've put things off, and a lot of the tax base has been eliminated by giving incentives for industries to come here, and even local industries have come and said, hey, we're not going to stay here unless you give us a tax freeze or just eliminate our taxes. And so we don't have a lot of room to grow in that regard, and we're challenged by our boundaries and people move into Mississippi and move into Arkansas and Tipton and whatever. So there are problems, but I think that they're different. And I really think the federal government's problems have been overblown. The Tea Party's got onto that idea about the debt, and even though economy's improved, we have decreased the debt greatly, and will increase the debt by passing immigration, which they're against, and by implementing the Affordable Care Act, we will decrease the debt, which they are against. They're still on their same mantra, and that's one of the places, Bill, where the Tea Party just doesn't get it. They haven't changed their tune as the economy's changed, and the efforts of the Obama presidency has shown it to be successful. And Obama's team hasn't done a good enough job in letting the people know that we've had some successes economically, and the ACA and the immigration bill will save money in the long run and have reduced the debt. So I think there are differences. I think there are real differences.
But then, some of that, and I'll just dwell on this one more time, that people say, look, the city had to spend this money to bring in jobs and had to spend money to bring in things like the FedEx Forum because it's a civic boost and the corporations like it, and they have to spend the money on things like the main-to-main, connector and green lines and bike lanes and these things. So to some extent, it is still a similar sort of debate of how do you spend money to make the city more attractive to keep people from moving to Mississippi and the suburbs and so on and so forth. And part of my question is there more you can do as a U.S. representative to help Memphis in that sense, or is it just really it's beyond the federal government's purview?
Well, there's things we try to bring in as many projects as we can, and I'm awfully proud of the Main Street to Main Street project, which is going to be more than just bicycles and walking across the Mississippi as Moses did at the Red Sea, and that great bridge that we're going to have. It's going to be improvements to the Main Street Mall that needed to be done for years, and improvements to downtown in general. And we try to bring in, it was a Tiger grant, as much money as we can. I think we've done grants and programs that help benefit our community and bring money in here. But directly, it's a city issue and a chamber issue to bring in business and bring in jobs and to try to staunch the exodus of people and businesses. And it's tough when you've got two states right here competing with you with tax incentives. There's so much gone to Mississippi, and I don't know how we're going to be able to. It's going to be tough. And the Mayor Wharton's got a tough job, and I think I understand getting Electrolux and getting Mitsubishi; those are important. Now, how much you give to get them, there's a question.
Okay. Okay, Bill.
You certainly have worked with the Wharton administration on coming up with federal funding, in particular for Main to Main, the Tiger grant that we got for that. One of the things in the comptroller's report that he expressed concern about was the transfer of money that the city gets from one place to another, or an advance here to make something happen and then pay back the money. In terms of the federal funding that we've gotten, have you had any concerns about that, or have you seen any indication that kind of caused you to go, wait a minute, what happened there?
Well, I respect Justin Wilson greatly. The comptroller's an outstanding public servant. I'm happy he brought some the city council and the mayor to the table of realizing long-term debt's a serious problem. I haven't seen federal funds being used improperly, and so I haven't had that concern. I'm just concerned as a citizen of Memphis who wants to see the city prosper and a taxpayer.
Okay. Delta Airlines, you've been a big advocate and advocate for the Memphis Airport and air service in Memphis, a huge critic of Delta Airlines when the merger between Delta and Northwest happened, and in your view, promises were made by, I guess, Richard Anderson, CEO of Delta, that the hub would stay here, service might expand. It's been the opposite, obviously. You wrote recently a letter, I think, to another merged airline, American and US Air. Do you have some hope that there will be increased competition, that maybe on the other side of losing the Memphis hub, we actually get better fares and more competition among the airlines who do remain?
I think we'll get better fares. Jack Sammons is a positive go-getter, and I think he's
head of the airport authority.
He's going to do all he can, and George Cates is a great guy who's working on that. I'm meeting with those folks this afternoon to see where they're going. I suspect Southwest is going to come in here a little bit stronger than they are. I wish they'd keep their Atlanta route open. I hope American and US Air will bring another flight or two. I mean, they're not going to bring another hub. We've got the infrastructure for a hub. We've got an airport that's remodeled and it's in good shape, and we've got, as we all probably know, we've done the tarmacs over real well. Hopefully we'll have planes to put on them. But we're in trouble, and Richard Anderson and the NSA, I'm not sure who's more truthful. Probably the NSA. He flat out lied to us, and he said this merger was going to add flights, not subtract, and we've gone from 240, give or take, now we'll be to 60. Amsterdam disappeared. He said we'd have Paris possibly too. Well, that's just a lie. He knew that when he said it. So I hope the American and US Air people were more forthcoming in their proposal for a merger, and that's what I posed in my question, that Anderson has given mergers of airlines a black eye and executives, and that I had asked them and hoped they would consider and look at our airport, which is a facility that can serve more airlines. And maybe Southwest will come in more. They've got Little Rock, they've got Nashville. So it's unrealistic to think they're going to have a major hub, but they might flight some more flights. Whether JetBlue will come in here or Frontier, I don't know. Okay. We need to find somebody. And I think Jack's close to Fred Smith. The bottom line is Fred Smith is our best hope, because they fly so many people in and out of here, pilots, executives, and they can put cargo on those planes to help subsidize them. I think, Jack is like, he's close to Fred.
Yeah. Okay. Just a minute left, Bill.
You talked a bit about immigration reform. Immigration reform is also a local issue because it's a local issue in a very different way from, I think, the national debate we've seen over borders and fences in that regard. What do you look to come out of the discussion about that?
What I'd like to see have comprehensive immigration reform. I think it will reduce the debt. I think that there are citizens, the people in this country who want to be citizens, adults and kids, and the kids came here without any, malevolent intent. They came with their parents. They've lived here. I've seen them at Kingsbury High and other places. Good kids that want to serve in the military. They want to go to our state colleges at reasonable prices and get Hope scholarships, which they can't now because they're not citizens. We need that workforce. One of the first opportunities I had when I was elected to Congress in orientation session was at Harvard. And the head of the Kennedy School is a demographer, and he told us then that we do not have in the future a workforce that will keep our economy moving where we want it to be. And a lot of that's going to be Hispanics who come in and fill in. We need many more STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math people. And some of them will be Hispanics who are here and could be made legal. We need to have that and save money.
All right, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for being here. Thanks for joining us.
Eric,
Thanks, Bill.
nice to be with you.
Absolutely, and thank you for joining us. Join us again next week. Good night.